So, good evening and a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Ministry of Culture to this special program for commemorating centenary of Satyajit Ray. Friends, we've had a bad year because of the pandemic, which has been looming large, but we've all learned to adapt and move to the virtual medium. So, this is one such program where we are happy that we may not be able to physically join each other, but we are happy to be able to connect to one of the legends of Indian cinema, who happens to be one of the favorite actors of Satyajit Ray, Mr. Dhritiman Chaterji, who's with us here. And interestingly, his very first film was with Satyajit Ray, as you all know, famously, Pratidwandi. And Satyajit Ray's last film, commercial release, Agantuk, also happened to have Dhritiman Chatterjee. So he has a very unique distinction in that regard. And besides being, of course, phenomenally talented, uh, Dhritiman Da, as I'm privileged to call him, is a very nice, generous person and extremely knowledgeable and articulate. And it's such a pleasure to always talk to him. So, welcome, Dhritiman Da. We're so happy to have you here. It's an honor.
Thank you, Nirupama. Hello, Jai. And hello, all viewers and listeners. With your permission, Nirupama, before we start, may I just enter a disclaimer or a spoiler alert, if you want. The communication for this program, it speaks about Dhritiman Chatterjee's incredible journey with Rai. I just want to remind or tell viewers who don't know that my first film, as Nirupama mentioned way back in 1970, was with Rai. And then 20 years after that, I made another film called Kotru, Enemy of the People, with him. And I had exactly 1.25 scenes in his last film, Agantuk, The Visitor. So to talk of Dhritiman Chatterjee's incredible journey with Rai is perhaps being a little too effusive. If there is one actor who really did have an incredible journey with Rai and who grew as an actor and as a person because of his links with Rai, that would have to be Soumitra Chatterjee, who unfortunately left us not that long ago. So that was just by way of a disclaimer.
Well, notwithstanding that disclaimer, Dhritiman, your journey has continued after Agantuk as well, because you have played Professor Shanku as well, and I think you acted in a film called Double Feluda. And of course, you are such an important member of the Society for Preservation of Satyajit Ray Archives. You contributed to books on Ray, like Deep Focus. So your contribution really continues, perhaps much more than even Soumitra.
Well, I mean, those of us who knew him try to do our bit to not so much to keep his memory alive, and I hope that theme will come up in this discussion. Not so much to keep his memory alive as to keep his work relevant today. I think that is the key, and that is more important than celebrating memories.
Sure.
But I'm sure we'll come to that.
We will. Friends, we're also joined by Jai Arjun Singh. Jai is a prolific film writer. When I say prolific, I really mean it, because he has a long-running blog called Jabberwock. And of late, in fact, when I'm tempted to write something about cinema, unfortunately, I remember maybe Jai has written about this, and lo and behold, 9 times out of 10 he has. So he's that prolific. And he has written 2 lovely books on cinema, one on Janebi Yaro making, and the other about the world of Rishikesh Mukherjee. And when he's not saving street dogs, I think he takes time out to teach film students, as well as hold some of these nice sessions online. Dhritiman, I must tell you this also. We just had a session on Ray, and Jay curates these very nice film sessions, and his taste is very eclectic. So we go into Hollywood films and Indian cinema and all that. So we've been having nice addas.
You mentioned the blog. I just went to your blog, Jai, and I was very curious that you had this session on the 2nd. Did you, on Rai's films?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, just a week ago. So,
Did it
so,
go?
that was just really a celebration. It covered various aspects of his life and work,
Yeah.
and there were a few people who were much more knowledgeable about Satyajit Ray than I was. So I just let them have the stage and talk about share anecdotes and memories and things.
Just out of curiosity, who were they? These two that you mentioned.
These are, I mean, mainly film buffs who have followed Ray cinema for a longer time than I have, and also have had the advantage of being Bengali to start with. People like, there's the writer Salil Tripathi. I don't know if you know him. There's there are a few others, mainly members of my film club who have been Satyajit Ray fans for a long time.
And
Right.
Tipu as well, right? Tipu, whom Satyajit Ray knew
Tipu
as
Gurkayast, yeah, he's yeah,
Yes.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Jay, why don't you set the ball rolling?
So I just want to just add a caveat to what you said earlier about having just done those two films, plus a small role in Agantuk. This is a question of quality over quantity. If you just look at your performances in Pratidwandi and Ganshatru and the range of those two characters, it covers so much. And you already know this. You might even be a little fed up of hearing it, but there are generations of film buffs who have been utterly besotted by your performance in Pratidwandi and by your presence in that film. I'm certainly among them. Many of my friends are as well. And there's something that Mr. Ray famously said about you in that film.
Here it comes. Here it
Here
comes.
it comes. You've heard this before many times, and I'm going to read out part of this. It's a very famous quote. His definition of a star or a star actor, and what he said was, a star is a person on the screen who continues to be expressive and interesting even after he or she has stopped doing anything. It includes anyone who keeps his calm before the camera, projects a personality, and evokes empathy. And and he mentions you as one of the people, one in Pratidwandi, as an example of someone who does that, which is it's also quite a remarkable statement to make about a young man who was appearing in his first film at the age of 24 or 25, I think you were. And I know that you were part of a film society in college that had where you contacted people like Satyajit Ray and Mrinal Sen as film buffs, and then you ended up being cast in this film. One thing I was always curious about when it comes to Pratidwandi is that it felt like Satyajit Ray in casting someone like you, a newcomer in this lead role, he was also moving out of his own comfort zone to some degree. He had been working with with an established crew of actors up till then, and Pratidwandi also felt like it was a movement into uncharted terrain for him in a way, because you have the use of handheld cameras. You have this somewhat different aesthetic from the films that he had perhaps made up to the late 60s. Is that something that you experienced when you became part of the film, and also just part of this? To what degree did he encourage you to improvise or to bring your own ideas about the character to the table? Because he was, of course, he was such a disciplined and well-planned auteur, someone who storyboarded his films beforehand. But when you started working with him, did you feel like you had some leeway to explore the character?
Okay, I'll come to that, Jai, but if I may, I'll quickly sort of talk about what you just said about it being Pratidwandi being a departure from what he had done before. At that time, which was 1968, 1969, which was a very turbulent period, as you know, in politically in Bengal. The left movement was rising. So the situation was politically very charged, and people were responding to it in their own ways. And there was a sort of unsaid criticism bubbling under the surface, including from Rai's very close friend, Chidananda Dasgupta, who was a very distinguished critic, that perhaps he was not addressing contemporary realities, strongly enough. In many ways, Pratidwandi was his response to that criticism. And also, you're right, it was a breakaway in terms of handheld shots, freezes, techniques that were more associated with his contemporary Mrinal Sen, but not with him. So there was that. But Rai, at the end of the day, in my observation, was always a very practical sort of person. In every film that you look at, he knew that he had to work quickly. He knew that he had to work on limited budgets. So part of all the handheld stuff and so on was just a practical response. I mean, to give you one example, there is a sequence where this protagonist, he's walking along in what used to be called Lindsay Street in the Newmarket area in central Calcutta, and Rai is following him with the camera. Now, these days, to do that scene with proper lighting and police permission and, vanity vans for the stars and all of that would probably have taken 3 days. Now, no way could Rai afford 3 days for that. So that applies to a lot of Pratidwandi, that it had to be done here and now. I remember one occasion where this character which I play and his girlfriend are on a double-decker bus. So we literally stood in the middle of course, things didn't used to be as crowded in those days. So the little unit and the girl and I, Jayashree Roy, we just stood with Rai at a bus stop. He stuck his hand out at a double-decker bus. On we got, went to the first floor and shot. A lot of it was done like that. Of course, he could do it because he was who he was. Now, coming to the second part of your question about, how the acting thing went at that time, there are 2 or 3 things. One is, and this I realized much later, it is often said or remarked upon how good Rai is with first-timers, how good he is with amateurs, whom he just picks up and asks them to play small roles. It occurred to me later that one of the things he always did with newcomers, of course, I was not a newcomer strictly speaking, since we had met once earlier in relation to this film magazine. But one of the things that he used to do was talk to them, sit and just chat with them for a long, long time. Not necessarily about the film at all, but about various things, family, interests, sports, politics, and so on. I realized later that one of the reasons he did this was that he keenly observed the person, observed his or her manner of speaking, observed what we these days call body language, and tried to incorporate these things when he wrote the role finally, so that the actor, a newcomer, became much more relaxed, and it became much more easy for him or her to perform. So that was one side of it. The second issue with relation to that role is that Siddhartha Chaudhary was a person that I was very familiar with. I mean, I came from the same middle-class background. Luckily, I was not unemployed, unlike him, but we came from the same middle-class background. We had the same, college, educational backgrounds. We were familiar with the ultra-left movement going on at the time. I had very good friends who continue to be friends to this day in the left movement. So it all seemed familiar territory. That's the second aspect. Third aspect is that Rai, even though, as you mentioned, he wrote very meticulously, he didn't insist that his dialogue was cast in stone. I mean, if you wanted to, if you if you felt comfortable, you were free to kind of, tweak it a little bit, preferably with his permission. But even if you didn't take his permission, it was all right. So, these are some of the factors.
Thanks so much for clarifying that last bit in particular, because that's what I was really wondering. When it comes to certain sorts of directors who have a reputation for being exceptionally well planned, doing their own storyboards, etc., before the shooting of a film. Sometimes, you have these anecdotal stories about those directors being too rigid with their actors, just forcing their actors into a very specific template and not allowing them to breathe outside of that space. So of course, what you're saying is that Satyajit Ray wasn't like that.
Yeah. One of the reasons, of course, is, since you mentioned it, one of the reasons is because he was controlling all these aspects himself. He was writing the screenplay, he was writing the dialogue, he was doing the camera work, he was directing, he would edit, and so on. Sometimes what happens, and I mean, no disrespect to anybody, but I've faced this in Bombay, is that each discipline is like someone's preserved. Screenplay is someone's preserved. The camera work is someone's preserved. And so a screenplay writer or a dialogue writer in the Bombay industry wants to show it off. And I don't mean show off in any pejorative sense, but wants it to be recognized as his or her work. I mean, even though I worked in Hindi films, my Hindi is I'm not as comfortable, especially when speaking dialogue. I don't even know whether I should say this publicly, but since I've said it, what to do? As in Bengali, but I faced this, sometimes when I wanted to change around a little bit, because some of the words I'm not that comfortable with, the dialogue writers have been, let us say, less than happy with that.
So interesting you said this, Dhritimanda, that, because Rai has mentioned this in one of his writings. In fact, I think his convocation address to FTII students when he went in 1974, I remember him making a statement and he said, this will shock a lot of you, but in Indian films, the director has to do nothing. Because everyone you get a talented team, the cameraman does his job, the music composer does his job. If you are lucky to get good actors, the director does nothing. And then he, of course, went on to say, I hope that you learn something and each of you brings something of your own to the film. So, of course, he was talking in the context of having a larger education than just training, which I will come back to later. But, growing up when you were in your 20s, when you happened to act in this film, it was an interesting period because if you see, after the sheen of the 1950s, the idealism was wearing off. I think this was an important period when unemployment and discontent really started because a number of Hindi films also around the same time, including Basu Chatterjee's film, I remember Sara Akash had just come 1 year before. And there's a similar theme of unemployment. Of course, the protagonist there takes it out on his poor uneducated, educated wife, I'm sorry. And then you had... before that was Mahanagar, of course. In fact, I wanted to ask you this: why do people just call this the trilogy of urban films of Ray? Pratidwandi and Janaranya, and in the middle Shimabada. Whereas actually, I think it was Mahanagar, if I'm not mistaken, which really was the first city film.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's this Calcutta trilogy is a convenient label, but it's not terribly accurate because you can't talk about his city films. You can't. When you talk about his city films, you absolutely cannot leave Mahanagar out of it. I mean, because it was not only about the city and the socio-economic context, but very importantly, it was about womanhood and
absolutely.
The image and the place of the woman.
Yeah, in fact, there were other similar films I remembered because Rajnigandha, again, a very good film from Basu Chatterjee. Also, an interesting aspect is all of these are literary adaptations. I think that perhaps was a forte of somebody like Rai. I want to say that because he was one of the few filmmakers, I put Basu Chatterjee also in that category, who wrote their own screenplay based on a good book. So I
Yeah.
think that made a remarkable difference, didn't it? Because
Well, I
possibly literature can go much deeper into these realities when you start writing about them, about a woman's role, her position in society, the
yeah.
man versus woman, the relationships, how they change because of the socio-economic realities.
I mean, I'm sure it's. Thank you for mentioning that. I'm sure, scholarly and academic work has been done. I know it's been done in Bangla. I'm sure it's been done in English about Rai's connection to literature and how he derived from literature, because a lot of his work is in fact derived from literature. And what is interesting to me is to see how he transformed or adapted a story or a novel for his users.
Mm-hmm.
You know, okay, another aside here, which which viewers might enjoy, is that to this day I have not read Pratidwandi. Let me confess that.
Yeah, we
Uh,
read it somewhere. Yes.
Yeah, the reason is that, anytime I'm involved with a film which is based on literature, if I've not read it, then I prefer not to read it, because I've always felt that my obligation is to the screenplay and to the director's vision as I understand it. So I would rather not confuse myself by, reading the original. One thing you have to remember about Bangla literature and about material that he took from there is that many Bangla novels, contemporary novels, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, was serialized in a highly regarded weekly journal called Desh.
Mm-hmm.
So now with serialization, just as with serialization on television, a property has to be stretched and stretched and stretched and stretched. Characters, incidents introduced. So Rai always tried to pare that down to a minimum, which you see particularly if you know the original. The wonderful effect of that you see in Days and Nights in the Forest, or on but a very, very sparse structure evolved from a serialized novel.
Because
And
in fact,
that's something I think it doesn't come as a surprise to hear that, because if you just look at the stories that Satyajit Ray wrote himself, his original short stories, those are things that are we am I audible?
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah. Sorry. So there is that similar, sparseness, in them as well, and a simplicity that can just be breathtaking. It's just only later that you think about it and analyze it. You see how many layers there are, but at the formal level, it just comes across as so lucid, so
yeah.
clear. And so I also wanted to, I'm glad that you touched on that point about how Satyajit Ray had these accusations, these allegations coming his way sometimes that he perhaps wasn't a political enough filmmaker compared to some others at the time. Because this is something that also came up in my conversation last week, and and one of the points that we were making was that even even a film like Gopi Gain Baga Bain is political in its own way. Everything doesn't have to be political in a very clearly spelled out or explicit way. But of course, with Pratidwandi, as you mentioned, he took it to a more overt place. And Nirupama, I think we had that short scene, that
Yeah.
famous scene from
With your
Pratidwandi, which you wanted
permission,
to show.
Dhritiman, once more, can we watch that interview? We have edited it. It's a very short clip because it's a
Certainly.
great favorite with all of us.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
The Prime Minister of England, the time of independence. Whose independence, sir? Our independence.
Thank you. What would you regard as the most outstanding and significant event
of the last decade. The war in Vietnam, sir. More significant than the landing on the moon? I think so, sir. Could you tell us why you think so? Because the moon landing, you see, we weren't entirely unprepared for the moon landing. We knew it had to come sometime. We knew about the space flights, the great advances in space technology. So we knew it had to happen. I'm not saying it wasn't a remarkable achievement, but it wasn't unpredictable. The fact that they did land on the moon. Do you think the war in Vietnam was unpredictable? Not the war itself, but what it has revealed about the Vietnamese people, about their extraordinary power of resistance. Ordinary people, peasants, and no one knew they had it in them. And this isn't a matter of technology, it's just plain human courage. And it takes your breath away. Are you a communist? I don't think one has to be one in order to admire Vietnam, sir. That doesn't answer my question. However, you may go now.
Wow, we just love this scene. It's just brilliantly written. How much of that was Rai and how much was you? We would love to know.
The writing was completely right. I am not even sure whether the Vietnam reference is in the original novel. But I mean, that interview scene, I loved it. I had a ball as an actor because, we were saying things that were close to our heart. And it was 1970, the Sorbonne riots, the revolution had happened 2 years ago in 1968. So it was a time of ferment. It was a time of great ferment and of, and of expressing what you wanted to say. It was very, and especially today, when things are much more restrictive, it is wonderful to think back to a very much more permissive time, very much more permissive, progressive time. And Jai, your question about political film, I am reminded of something that Rai said. In fact, he said it in 1970. He said political consciousness can also mean to be conscious of the failure of our politicians. So if you sort of think about that, then that means today all of us are politically conscious, because all of us are more than aware, acutely aware of the abject failure of our politicians.
Right.
So, I mean, we can continue discussing this issue of political cinema, or we can go on to something else.
Before we move on, I'm just going to embarrass you a little bit again, sir, by reading out another favorite passage from just 2 or 3 sentences from this book by John W. Hood. It's called Beyond the World of Apu. And I think it just captures something very specific and very important about your presence in Pratidwandi and also the way in which Satyajit Ray used you. The selection of Dhritiman Chaterji for the role of Siddharth was a real casting coup by Ray. His considerable acting talent aside, the major asset that he brings to this film is his face. It is a particularly beautiful face, both intriguing and attractive. But more important is its profound expressiveness, allowing the character to be interpreted by the camera as much as by his action and dialogue. And I think that scene we just saw, the interview scene, though of course it's driven by dialogue and by some very by something very specific that's going on between the interviewers and the potential candidate. I think so much of the quality of that scene also just comes from the pauses in your in your delivery and in the expressiveness of your face. The little moment that comes early on where Siddharth realizes that that this probably isn't going to work out for him, but he's still determined to say what he wants to say. I think a little nuance like that really comes across. And I think Pratidwandi is as much a film of silences and pauses as it is a film of dialogue.
Of course. I mean, the first thing I'd thank you for that quotation from Hood. I'm grateful that neither of you made out that my ears were going red with embarrassment. But what I wanted to say was something a little more basic, which is that, all the pauses, the facial expressions, all of that, while working with Rai, it was all, instinctive, in the sense that there was hardly any, even a scene like that, maybe he'd run through it once before taking it to ensure that the lights and everything else was in place, but hardly ever to rehearse the actors. It was a kind of organic thing, and a great deal of it depended on a bond of trust that developed between the director and the actor, a kind of unspoken, I don't know how to describe it, or to rationally analyze it. It's a question of a kind of chemistry where both of them sort of know in their heads what the other one is doing. You know what I mean? That with Rai, often, especially in crucial scenes like this, it used to work like this. Why else would I did this film, then, the handful of films I did later, all of them, one way or the other, most of them had to do with the angry young man sort of. So otherwise, why would he cast me in a completely different kind of role 20 years later in Ganashut, Enemy of the People, if there wasn't this kind of unspoken, implicit sort of trust and confidence?
In fact, that's since you bring that up, that's a question I was going to ask you about. How it's a fascinating arc from the dreamy-eyed young man in Pratidwandi to the cynical establishment figure in Ganashatru, and which is also an absolutely fabulous performance. And it's if you were to watch the two films back to back, you can scarcely believe that the same actor is playing the two roles. But one of the things that gets said very often about Satyajit Ray's cinema is that as a humanist, he wasn't very interested in villains. He didn't really have stereotypical villains in his films. He looked at people in all their dimensions, except perhaps in the fantasies or the children's films, which required mythical or larger than life characters. So I wanted to ask that when you worked with him again 20 years later in Ganashatru and playing a character who was so different, who was definitely the antagonist of the film. Did you feel at any point while working with him that Satyajit Ray also had a certain degree of empathy for that character, or at least the ability to understand where that character was coming from?
Yeah, he was, my feeling always has been about most of his characters, including this one, was that he was observing the character. He was not condemning the character. He was observing. He was trying to tell the audience what a certain set of social and political circumstances could do to a person. That was it. And it was, I'm sure, since it brought in issues of political convenience, religious fundamentalism, and so on, I am sure that particularly in the environment that we are living in, this character would seem familiar to a lot of people, I'm sure. So therefore, again, there was no rehearsal. I read the script and off we went. Once I remember, after having worked for a few days, there was this niggling sort of worry in my mind of, is this going the way that he wants it? I was quite happy, but is it going the way that he wants it to go? So I asked him one day, and this has to be said in Bangla, I asked him, Manikda ঠিক-ঠাক হচ্ছে তো? Meaning, Manikda, is it going all right, do you think? So his only response was, যদি ঠিক না হয়, তাহলে আমি বলবো. If it is not going well, I'll let you know. That was it.
But then you had also in Agantuk, the character was very interesting, that Nishid Gupta is a sort of a contrarian who always has to come and spoil their...
Well, I mean, somehow, as we were talking about a little while ago, 20 years before that with Siddhartha, I, in a sense, thought I was playing myself, sort of. And then, as Jai was saying, came Kotru, and there was this very cynical establishment character. Who knows? Perhaps I had tried, although I hate to think so, but perhaps I turned cynical and established myself after 20 years. I hate to think that. But otherwise, why would he, when it came to a so-called negative character, why would he say to himself, all right, I know the guy for that, go and fetch that guy, he'll be able to do it? I mean, why? Why wouldn't he give me a relatively more sympathetic roles? I'm just joking, but thought occurs sometimes.
I wanted to ask something because, of course, you all were very good friends. I'm sure Soumitra Chatterjee as well. But is there any role of his that you wish you had done? Because after all, you're younger to him by about a decade, if I'm not mistaken.
10 years, exactly.
Yeah, but then, at any time, this sort of, I wouldn't call it rivalry, but,
well, I mean,
I wish I had done this.
The broad answer to that is that any actor in that generation, my contemporaries, any actor would have killed to play Feluda. Of course, that goes without saying. Everybody knows that. But at that time, excuse me, when Rai started doing Feluda, I have to say that at a personal level, I never felt deprived. I was very happy that Soumitra was doing Feluda. But there have been roles. I mean, I would have, for example, loved to play Amol in Charulata. I would absolutely love to play.
That's one of my favorite Rai films. You've always said that.
Yes, I would have absolutely loved to play Amol in Charulata. Soumitra, I don't know whether we are going to talk about Soumitra, but he was, of course, as we all know, very, very good in some non-Rai films as well. And there are roles there which I thought, if only I could have. You know what I mean? But certainly...
let me just jump in to say that much as I loved Soumitra Chatterjee in the Feluda films, that I think you would have been wonderful as well. And you as a different sort of Feluda. And of course, you were probably closer in age to the character when Sonar Killa was made, for instance. So that would have been very interesting to see.
Yeah. So, there to extend that a little bit, Feluda, of course, is a very well-loved character, both in print as well as in cinema. But the thing about Feluda is that from his stories, we get a very rounded, complete description of Feluda, including the brand of cigarettes he smokes, which is not the case with Shanku, which we've started doing, but the circumstances have got in the way. So we, of course, hope to continue the series. The thing about Shanku is that it's written in diary form. It's written as a first-person diary. So from the Shanku stories, you don't really get to know a great deal about the person himself. The only way you get to know him is from Rai's sketches, where he's sketched as a sort of a mad scientist. But then that also, after Rai passed and after other people illustrated Shonku, his physical appearance changed as well. So it's only in one of the late Shonku stories where he's talking about his father that you get some sense of the sense of values he's inherited. So you get some inkling of personally what kind of person he might have been. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that normally, whether with Rai or with other directors, I have not been a great one for analysis, workshops, reading the novel. I mean, I find all that quite a bore, quite frankly, and somewhat unnecessary. So I tend to go by instinct and by my conviction about the filmmaker. But Shonku is one case where one had to really work hard and read the stories, sort of try and garner little bits about the character, have long conversations with Shondeep to get a fix on what he should look like, what he should do, how he should talk, etc. on screen. I had to.
Sorry. Please continue.
No, sorry, please.
Jay, I wanted to share some pictures which I have of different characters.
Right.
But I just show those. Yeah. Because the arc is so fascinating. This, the look. Yeah. So this, as we know, is the young Siddharth, of course, a very dashing figure. Jay, I remember you telling me how the whole generation had a crush on
Yes.
Siddharth.
I have so many friends, including many male friends who were completely smitten by Siddharth and Pratidwandi.
Wonderful thing, really. The wonderful thing is that even now when one goes to film seminars, things like that, what is very heartening is when young people come up and tell me how relevant to their own lives they still find these characters, Siddhartha Chaudhary. That is the really wonderful thing.
And then you have a complete contrast, as you know.
Okay, let's remember, as one grows older, gets full of anecdotes. So this one, please remember this image because I'm going to come back to it.
Go ahead. We want to know about
all right, we were talking about Kotru and the fact that, there was never very much dissection or analysis and so on. When Rai said, okay, you're going to do this role, and I went to see him, one of the very first things he did was to get the person in charge of wardrobe to measure me out for footwear. One of the very first things, literally. So I thought, why is this happening? Why is it happening right now? Why is it happening first thing? So then, going on to the sets, I was given a pair of shoes with extra high heels. And I was wondering why. I didn't ask. But of course, before that, all the beard and all that stuff had been worked out. But shoes with extra high heels. I didn't realize why until we came to this scene. Here, Soumitra Da, who's taller than me, and we were standing next to each other. He's speaking, I go grab the mic and I start speaking and so on. And Rai is doing a trolley shot. The fact that it would help his framing if both actors were of a similar height had occurred to him even before we started shooting. So therefore, the first thing he did was to ensure that both actors were actually of the same height. That was the kind of detail that he...
No, that's such a fascinating story.
Yeah.
And also, I was thinking, at that stage in his career, in the last few years of his filmmaking life, he was also, as we know, he was slightly compromised because of ill health. He had been, he was he was finding it a bit difficult to make. He tended to shoot a lot of films indoors and things like that. So just a reminder that there's so much more to a great filmmaker who has control over every aspect of his craft. Even when some people talk about the last 2 or 3 films as perhaps not being, they're at par with his very best work, but the mind is still just as sharp as ever, I think.
Yeah.
And I think the third picture.
Yes.
Very
interesting look. Very interesting look indeed. Yeah.
So sir, here again, that there's such a big jump from there was a jump from Pratidwandi to Ganashatru. Those were still the fairly grounded, realistic films, and here you're playing a character that comes from the other, more playful side of Satyajit Ray's imagination. His work in science fiction, fantasy, which is something that still perhaps doesn't really get talked about as much as it should, because the certain narrative was set, especially with Western critics in the 50s, 60s, about Ray being this serious, grounded filmmaker. And I know even a film like Goopika and Bagabain perhaps didn't get the attention outside India that it might have. So is this an aspect of Satyajit Ray cinema that or his writings, his literature, that you have been involved with for some time, or that you have followed?
Well, I mean, obviously his writing as a young person, one used to follow Feluda and Shonku and so on and so forth. And as you probably know, they're still very, very popular with children and young people. One of the wonderful things that happened with Shonku is that, young kids who went to see Shonku were taken to see it by parents who were more familiar with Shonku than kids were, because, the taste of kids have changed. But one of the most heartening things is when parents came up and told us, that is Shondeep and me, that, thank you very much, because now we have been able to rekindle our children's interest in the Shonku stories, and we've been able to, persuade them to read the stories again. So that was very, 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 very nice to hear. As for it not having got as much recognition abroad, it's more playful films. That is true. I mean, I suppose it's inevitable that if you're a well-known figure in any field, you tend to get branded and put into a particular box. It's forgive me for saying this, Jai, but it is probably more convenient for critics that way. Makes their job easier if they're able to label and label and box. So I suppose there was some of it there. But then let's not forget that since you mentioned Goopika, let's not forget that Goopika happened, Pratidwandi happened in 1970. We had the emergency in 1976. And then we had an outright political film in Hirok Raja Deshe in 1980. Let us also not forget that Hirok Raja Deshe was produced by the government of West Bengal. Let us also not forget that another very powerfully political film called Sadgati happened in the following year, in 1981. Let us also not forget that Sadgati was produced by Doordarshan. I am not, for obvious reasons, comparing it with the political and cultural environment we are forced to live in today. But surely it is comment. I mean, I keep wondering whether if Sadgati had been produced and released now, whether somebody would have complained about it hurting their religious sentiments and whether, it would have been taken down. These are the times we live in.
No, absolutely, and similar questions do come up about around some of the Hindi films from the art house. There's a so-called art house movement of that time. I've been asked similar questions about Jaane Bhi Do Yaron, for instance, which was made by which was produced by NFDC and by other films made by people like Govind Nilani. So certainly that question is very relevant.
I mean, Rinalda's Calcutta films would probably have been banned now,
Right. Do we have any questions from the chat that we need to address? Basav did ask about the fact that you also worked in Mrinal Sen's Padarthik just a couple of years after Pratidwandi. I was just wondering about if you could just very quickly give us some sort of insight into how different they were as filmmakers in terms of how they either in terms of how they treated you as an actor or briefed you as an actor, or in terms of their approach to film form. Could you share something?
Very quickly. They were just temperamentally, they were very different kinds of people. I mean, I loved Ronaldo. He was so outgoing. It was wonderful to have conversations with him. He was very much more of an extrovert. Also, we have to remember that he was a politically engaged person. Both he and his wife, he was not a member of the Communist Party, to the best of my knowledge, but both he and his wife were involved with the Indian People's Theatre movement. So he was much more explicitly politically engaged, and from a certain time that came into his cinema. And I mean, I used to visit him all the time, have chats. So the time for interview came around when he was going to make interview. I was hoping against hope that, I would get cast. So he said that, 2 reasons. One is that you've just done Pratidwandi. But the more important reason is that, in that interview scene, your English was too polished. My protagonist is a middle-class, unemployed protagonist. He can't speak English that well. So we'll do something together later. And that later was not, fortunately, very much later. Padarthik came along. As we know, Padarthik was an explicitly political film of political analysis about what was happening right then, for which he had to face quite a bit of flack from his comrades. So that happened. But in general, he was a much more improvised sort of person. I mean, in the sense that Padarthik, just to give you an example, even 2 or 3 days before the shooting was going to end, nobody knew, including Mrinal Sen himself, how the film was going to end. I mean, he knew that there had to be an ending, but nobody knew. I mean, in Akale Chandani, which we did much later, Smita and I had to improvise a couple of scenes, if I remember, the dialogue completely, because just before we were going to take it, all of us realized to our consternation, including Mrinal Sen, that he hadn't given us the dialogue. So he said, "It's all right. You know what it's about." Just which was great fun. It was wonderful working with him. And even though he had this sort of happy-go-lucky kind of attitude, he was a very, very wise man. I mean, he's told me things about cinema which I still remember and treasure. I mean, for example, when we were talking about what is contemporary cinema, what is contemporary in cinema, he said that, as far as Rai is concerned, I consider Aparajito one of his most contemporary films. I know it's a period film, but contemporary has nothing to do, in my mind, about whether it is set in the here and now or not. In my mind, contemporary has to do whether a director deals with an issue, any issue, with a contemporary sense. That is what, to me, makes it contemporary. And
The question. Sorry, I'm sorry. You had put a very long question about your acting style and why
I'll just summarize the question that Hema asked.
But
Actually,
you already answered it, Jay, more or less. Because he said about how he wanted somebody to talk more contemporary idiom, right? That's what he was talking
But that's an interesting point that Hema makes there in the charter. The Dhritiman is closer to Chobi Biswas in his style.
But you ask him, he may not agree with
that. Unfortunately, not in his height, though. Right. But thank you for saying that. That's that's a wonderful comparison.
We also wanted to ask you, what do you like watching these days, and what is your preference? And do you watch these Netflix and Amazon and Mubi?
Well, I mean, it's, of course, we are all homebound, can't go, so therefore we have to watch what is served up to us on OTT platforms and so on. But to use a contemporary term, in the last while, I've been absolutely freaking out on Malayalam cinema. To be
quite acted in a film, right? Recently,
yes.
maybe a couple of years back.
Some time ago. But I'm finding it so exciting and so refreshing.
It is. I think all of us have watched a lot of Malayalam films last year. Yes.
Also Marathi cinema.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There has been some wonderful work done, I think, in both those languages.
Yeah.
Jai, some time ago, when you were reading this very complimentary quote from Rai about what makes a star, this is not connected to what you've been speaking about, but there used to be a time in our cinema where a star had to be good looking, and a woman star had to be good looking. But we've passed all that. Look at Nawaz, look at Irfan, look at people like that. Look at Fahad. Why it occurred to me is look at Fahad in cinema. You could pass Fahad on the road without giving him a second glance. But he has that magnetism. I think that is the star quality, the magnetism.
Absolutely. I think we will not keep Dhritiman any longer. We had promised him 45 minutes. I think we already overshot that time.
Yeah, you're being very polite. Nirupama. What you really want to say is that enough is enough.
No, not at all. We can talk for another hour, but I promised him 45 minutes. It's been 1 hour.
No, it's been wonderful. It's been wonderful talking. Yeah. So shall we say our respective goodbyes now?
Yes, and I thank you so much for joining us today. And I really hope that we'll meet, when this pandemic is over, in person, because
a
long time.
Yes, well, we talk of meeting face to face, but now I think that terminology has to change also, and we'll have to start talking of meeting mask to mask.
Less today in the safety of our homes.
Okay, thanks a lot, both of you.
It's been wonderful. Thanks a lot, and please stay well, which is the parting greeting for all of us now.
Absolutely, please stay.
Both of you too, and seriously, Nirupama, Jai, let's hope we meet and continue this conversation in better times.
Absolutely,
we will.
Let's keep enjoying watching films. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Stay safe.